All right. So it's interesting that Rosella touched upon public space as a fundamental right of urban citizens, and that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about, but from the perspective of a country which does not have adequate public space in most of its large metropolises. So I belong to one such large metropolis, and that's Chennai. So I'm going to try and present a view of cities across India, try and establish what the state of public space in these cities are, what the state of tactical urbanism is in India, and then kind of look at a sort of post-pandemic response for it. So I'm going to be taking it back to the basics for a little bit, if that's all right with you, and I'll try and be a little quick with it. All right, so I start with the state of public spaces in Indian cities. So, UNESCO's definition of public space is that a public space refers to an area or place that is open and accessible to all peoples, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, age, or socioeconomic level. So now, generally, the purpose of a public space is to provide a backdrop for social interactions, to provide a sense of belonging to the residents, for recreation, for mental and physical health and well-being, and for civic participation activities. But increasingly, we see public spaces, especially in the Indian context, in the neoliberal era that we are in right now. We see that public space is more of a mall or a transportation area, like the streets, which have been completely taken over by cars, as Graham had mentioned before. So that's kind of what I want to address. So the Indian public space, this is what it looks like. It's a lot of chaos, it's a lot of infrastructural elements, it's a lot of cars. And if you see, there are people in between all of those as well, to your left. That is a photograph from a city called Allahabad. Now, this is not even like a large metropolis in the Indian context. It's probably a tier 2 or a tier 3 city, and this is how crowded it is. And there's no sort of dedicated space for pedestrians, cyclists, or any kind of citizen to citizen level interaction. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have the malls, which are now considered public spaces, but these are not necessarily open to all. They don't provide access to everyone. And the rules of engagement in these spaces are quite well defined. You cannot sort of hold a protest in here, for example. It's more of a consumerist haven that is masquerading as a public space, but that's most of what we get. At the same time, you also see these a few riverfronts which are still quite nicely planned, but that's on your left, which is from Patna, I think. Now, these are spaces which are nice for urban residents. So there are tastes of such spaces in maybe tier 2, tier 3 cities, which are not as crowded. But then again, when you look at the image on your right, and that's my home city in Chennai, and this used to be a city of 3 rivers, and now all of them are almost polluted, and you cannot use it for drinking water or for recreation along the. There used to be a very sort of active public life, cultural life along these rivers, because rivers are also considered sacred in Hinduism. But right now, all that has been deteriorated, and it's only the urban poor who live along these rivers. So, like I said, cities in India, especially the big metropolises, are highly, highly cramped. The only exception probably being Delhi, because it's the capital city and it was planned as a capital city by the British. So if you see the amount of public space in Chennai, Bangalore, Mumbai, Pune, and Trivandrum, it's quite dismal. It's far below the minimum requirements that have been established by WHO. To give you some context, London has about 32 square meters per capita, while New York has, I think, 20 something, I'm not very sure, but above 20 square meters per person. So in this sort of scenario, how does tactical urbanism in the country work? So tactical urbanism is supposed to be an approach to neighborhood building that uses short-term, low-cost, and scalable interventions and policies to catalyze long-term change. So this is the brief. This is the definition of tactical urbanism. Now, how it works in the Indian scenario is a little bit different because when it comes to tactical urbanism projects in India, it's mostly focused on street reconfiguration projects, urban mobility projects, which have taken place in a fair few number of cities around the country. But if you look at it, it becomes like a temporary sort of reconfiguration of the space. And once the paint wears off, it's back to the so-called normal. So it again with such measures also, like the image on the left, if you see, even though you're trying to widen the pavement and so on, there are still vehicles that do inevitably come onto the pavement. So these measures, even though they have been attempted, I would say they haven't been very successful so far. Because mostly these are done in collaboration with local municipal bodies and non-profit organizations, and not necessarily the residents themselves, which means that sometimes the residents don't connect enough with it, or there might be multiple reasons for why this happens. There are also a few public space interventions that happen, but these are very sporadic and very few around the country. So during the pandemic, so we looked at the pre-pandemic sort of state of tactical urbanism in the public arena in India. But during the pandemic, what we saw was a lot of social distancing measures and artwork that came up in the urban realm. Now, the focus here was to create awareness through these artworks to encourage people to stay at home. And the second was to make sure that people are maintaining social distancing. So with this in mind, how do we look at the post-pandemic city? So the challenge of COVID in India especially is that there is not enough public space. And even in places like Delhi, where I said that there was sufficient public space, it's not necessarily that all people have access to equal amounts of public space. So in this kind of scenario, people lived in very cramped conditions, especially in informal settlements. And in this case, the risk of catching the virus outdoors is, outdoors is supposed to be lesser, but then there are no outdoors to go to. So in this case, going any kind of outdoor activity is potentially dangerous or intimidating to citizens. So social distancing becomes really difficult for people living in these settlements. And also something that's not spoken about enough is the fact that there is a need to get out. Being locked down all the time it has a negative impact on your physical and mental health. So in this scenario, how do we create sort of public spaces? I've come up with sort of three types of responses that can be done. The first one is the adaptation of existing public space. So the image on your left is from Myanmar, I believe, and it looks at how a socially distanced market is possible. There is a need to kind of reconfigure the spaces that we are used to and how we use those spaces through architectural and urban design interventions. Also, if you know about any of the recent history in India right now, there were quite a few protests going on just before the onset of this outbreak. Now, these protests have been completely taken off the streets because it's no longer safe to do this. And yet, the image on your right shows a socially distanced protest in Tel Aviv, Israel. So we need to kind of adapt these, whatever few public spaces that we have, to make sure that people can still engage with each other and with the city they belong to. There's also a need for transition towards active streets. This is something we've seen before the pandemic as well. There were initiatives like car-free Sundays, where certain roads by the beach were blocked off to involve the public in various activities over the weekend or on Sundays and such. And at the same time, we see this kind of response around the world in places like Paris, Berlin, Bogota, where this widening of the cycle routes and things have happened. Now, something important that needs to be mentioned here is that most Indian cities do not have dedicated, properly established cycling routes. So, or pedestrian routes, for example, you might be walking along a pavement, one pavement might be non-existent, the next one might be 2 meters wide, and then back to 2 feet with a lot of obstructions. So it's not an ideal environment for any person to be walking or riding a cycle in. So I'm just going to wind up with my last approach, which is appropriating new areas for public space. So this is a research project that I had been involved in 2017, where I looked at establishing public spaces in abandoned historical buildings. Now I know that there is a need to be outdoors, but there is also this possibility of redefining what a public space could be. If there is enough space, even in an indoor situation, it could be safe. If you could have a socially distanced indoor public space, that is still something we can look at, because there's not a lot of urban space available to us right now. So this is the project. I'm not sure whether you can read everything, but this was done in phases, where in the first phase, we looked at raising awareness among people as to why they require public space, or why these buildings should be the right space to accommodate their needs. We looked at how marginalized communities in the area could be benefiting from this kind of public space. So this was the kind of space that I designed. So in this, using interventions like seating, play equipment, crates, temporary gardens, etc., you kind of appropriate this indoor space, which might be abandoned, but since it's a historical building, you wouldn't want to really touch the structure of the building, because that's a completely different, complicated procedure of it. So the idea was to appropriate these different buildings and create like a network of temporary public spaces, which in turn would catalyze an urban transformation of the area which was being studied, so that the area could become more and more suitable and beneficial to its citizens. So those were the three approaches that I came up with. Thank you so much.